Romans chapter 1, there is here a great exchange that is operating at the personal and the corporate level. Thus, the cumulative effect of each of these in individual lives adds up to dominate the exchange in the culture as a whole. And I want you to note how this text also reinforces the root, fruit, harvest cycle as it works out individually and corporately. And so Paul is doing this early on in the book for multiple layers, multiple reasons. And he is really grounding, first of all, a sort of history up to his time. And so there's allusions here to what we studied in Genesis 1 and through 3. And that exchange that has taken place down to the destruction of the world through the flood in Noah. And then in looking at each of the cultures around them as they also have collapsed. And you could look at any of the cultures down through history. This becomes sort of an interpretive grid to lay over their rise and fall. And how idols tend to dominate a culture and to the effect that they eventually lead to the destruction of a culture. Paul was living through the early part of this in Rome, and just watching the world around him. The Greco world had pretty well already collapsed. The Roman world was on the verge. And within 50 years of Paul's death, the Roman Empire was overrun by the Goths. And so he was doing that, but he also intended, as he was moving forward through the book, to set the stage for understanding what happens in the human hearts. After all, a culture is nothing but the sum and total of the human hearts that comprise that culture. And so there's a feedback loop, right, where individuals act, behave, believe a certain way. They do more and more culturally, which then feeds back and causes younger people to interact in the same way. And this can be for good within the context of God's people, but generally in the world, it's how the world functions. And I'm not going to read the text per se. We're familiar with this, but the idea here is that there is this great exchange that takes place. And this exchange that operates as lies in the realm of heart idols. So people believe lies. People believe myths. They think that they are truths. Or they are not concerned about truth per se. They're just concerned about their own narrative, story, So we can live in a world today, totally postmodern, where people can say, well, that's not my truth. What do you mean? How can that not be your truth? And so people have multiple sets of what are clearly conflicting, competing truths, but they don't view them that way. They just sit on the table, and the idea is that ultimate reality cannot be understood. Certainly not understood in a biblical way. And so what Paul lays out for us, beginning in verse 23, is that there is the exchange of the eternal glory of God for mortal creatures. And so verse 23 reads like this, verse 21 to set the background. And although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or gave thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And claiming to be wise, they became fools. Now, it's an allusion to Genesis 3, isn't it? Very clearly so. And exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds and animals and creeping things. This is what happens. So claiming wisdom, actually embedding themselves in foolishness, they now take what knowledge they had of God and exchange it for idol worship of things that they have made. This is what all peoples, this is what all nations do, scientific nations. Isn't it interesting to grow up in a culture that prizes itself on being scientific truth, who have bought into the most amazing myths and lies? But nevertheless, Romans 1 tells us that it happens and how it happens. And at the root of it is an exchange of the eternal glory of God for mortal creatures. All people have some knowledge of God. It comes to them through conscience, through creation, through culture. And so the second exchange is they exchange the truth of God for a lie. Verse 25. Therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their heart, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Now, notice that the sentence is actually chronologically in the opposite order than it reads in our English. See, God gave them up to lusts, to the dishonoring of body, because they had already exchanged. So verse 23 happens, the second part of verse 25 happens, and the consequences in the first part of verse 25. Okay, you see that? See how that works? And so they exchange the glory of God for mortal creatures. They elevate creation, whether it's people or creation in and of itself. And they exchange the truth of God for a lie, for what they know to be true. They exchange it for a lie. Now that happened with Eve, right? Here's the truth of God. She exchanges it for a lie, and as a result, there's consequence that flows out of that. And then in the second part of verse 25, they exchange the worship and service of God for the worship and service of creature. And so, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, as Francis Schaeffer said, all life is inherently about worship. Who do you worship? And therefore, whose favor are you seeking? Whose promises do you believe? Whose understanding of reality do you live by? Ultimately, that's worship. And so there is this exchange that takes place that we see all through history, and we see in cultures, and we see happening all around us. And this is happening at the heart idol level. And so in verse 26 comes the consummation. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, and for the women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And so they exchanged the obedience to God for the most debased of pleasures. And so a culture may begin at some kind of high level, and it has a culturally conscience-defined, creation-defined morality. And by the way, there is no amoral culture. An amoral culture ceases to exist in the first generation because it has no way to sustain its own life. So people can say, well, I don't believe it's I don't believe it's wrong to steal, but just don't take my stuff. And it goes on and on and on. And so even the most lawless cultures have within itself some kind of built-in morality. Otherwise, they simply self-destruct. And it's sometimes what happens when even in a lawless culture, it implodes because of what is going on. And all of this, again, is functioning at the human level. Culture is simply, I want to say this over and over again, culture is nothing but the whole of individuals, of people that make up, and of usually a smaller group of people who have a powerful impact on that culture. And so there is the exchange that operates as lies in the realm of heart idols. And you'll notice all through this, they're exchanging God, they're exchanging God's truth, exchanging God's glory, they're exchanging lies, truth for lies. And there always is a substitution that's taking place. There has to be. People cannot live in a moral vacuum. They cannot live in a theological vacuum. And, I sometimes am engaging with atheists and agnostics, and they'll talk about, and I'll just say, well, do you believe that such and such is wrong? Well, yes. I usually pick something egregious, right? And they'll say, well, of course. Why? What do you mean, why? Well, obviously it has to be wrong because. Why? Well, it's wrong because of this. Why? See, I keep asking why until you come to the point where they just have to say, well, just because it is. Why? Because ultimately behind all moral fabric lies God. Lies God. And so just simply, lovingly, one 3-letter question. Why is that true? Why is that true? Why do you think that? Now what you're doing is you're reversing the flow of this text, right? You're backing them up to where every man has some knowledge of God. And so this understanding of people as having a heart, an inner person that functions, and it functions a certain way, is not merely an insight for how believers are. All human beings function this way. All human beings are an outer physical person that engages the physical world, and all human beings have an inner person, the soul, the spirit, which where their personality, who they are, is embedded. And that's simply true. And the heart in all people functions this way. I was teaching in India in a church, and that church near it is a Hindu temple. And the pastor of the church had somehow befriended the Hindu priest. Now he was like the 5th generation priest in this temple. So his grandfather going back 4 generations. But he was illiterate. He could not read or write. And so invited him to come to the training course. Now we were all wondering, oh my goodness, what's this going to be like? And I was teaching on understanding the heart. Now it's a more abbreviated, and of course it's being translated. In fact, it's being translated 5 times, which was interesting in and of itself. But there were 6 languages in the room besides English. And so I would speak, my translator would translate into Kataka, and then different pods in the room were different languages, and a translator with his back to us would then whisper the translation as I went on. So you learn to teach with this multilingual hubbub going on in the room. And one of the teachers just had a really hard time doing that. You had to learn to tune it out. But there sat that Hindu priest and came every week and was there at least for this class on understanding the heart. At the end of it, teachers were receiving their acknowledgments in the amazing Indian fashion with our hats and our big garlands of stuff and our thrones, and anyway. And so he asked if he could speak. Oh, I could see it on the pastor's face. Oh no, do we allow this guy to speak? Well, let him speak, and then if we have to say something afterwards, we will. He got up, and then the translation back to me in English. He spoke in Kataka. The translation back to me in English, he said, I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in your Bible. But one thing is for sure. What this man has taught is how every person I know is. So, maybe it's true. Sat down. And since then, there's been multiple opportunities to share the gospel with him. Every human being functions in the way that this course is trying to teach, the way the Bible says, and what Paul says here in Romans 1. Now, the next thing that happened is there is an exchange that operates, that what God does then is God gives over. You see that language, God hands them over. Several different ways that translations do it. But there is this, you can feel the sense that God normally restrains a culture from becoming as evil as it could become, right? All people are depraved, but not all people live out their depravity to its nth degree. And that's by the restraining grace of God. And what you see here is as they make downward progress, what God does is hands them over to the next step. And so there is this downward progress. Once again, this is happening at the individual level. It happens to people. And it happens at the corporate level. It happens in cultures. It happens in nations, and so on. And so they are given over to lust because they embraced lies. Now what's interesting here is that there is this handover that since they embrace these lies, God hands them over to being controlled by the lusts. Now once again, I think what Paul is seeing here and what we should see is the interaction between what is going on in the heart. We believe, and therefore we are desiring what we believe to be true or what we don't believe to be true. There's an intricate connection between what we believe and the desires and wants of our heart. And so when they begin to believe lies, God hands them over to the lusts, the desires that flow from those lies. And you see that functioning through this text. And this is what happens to people. They don't believe God. They don't believe His Word. They don't believe truth, even the common truths that are shared in creation and conscience and in culture. And therefore, they buy into lies, and then that begins to fuel cravings and desires and lusts that emerge in feelings, emotions, and behaviors. And we'll look more at that model. But then notice that they are punished by being given over to the control of the desires of the flesh. So the inward desires, fueled by believing lies, then God's next step is to hand them over to where they have very little control over the desires of their bodies. Now the process is from inward outward, isn't it? And this is a process of transformation as well. But a culture, people, a nation collapse because they reach a point to where they cannot control the desires of their bodies. This is that handing over. Now, what does that handing over look like? Well, in verses 26 through 7, we already saw that God hands them over to degrading passions. What Paul's referring to here, and I think he's being descriptive in a way that does not permit us to fudge on the term. So we can talk about homosexuality and lesbianism, and then people can, out here. Paul doesn't do that. You'll notice he's about as close to describing what's going on without being graphic. So there's no middle ground. There's no way to play around with these terms because Paul hasn't used them. Paul's, in fact, been descriptive enough. You know exactly where he's coming from, what he's talking about. And so the ultimate handover in a culture, in a person's life, is when that culture accepts, approves, and largely practices different expressions of homosexual, same-sex attractions and activities. And that's what Paul is talking about here. And so he hands them over to these degrading passions. And so, you find in cultures all over the world where, though sometimes they won't admit it, this is a huge problem. And it hands over to many, many different kinds of degrading passions. Now, the reason that Paul does this to Rome is Rome was a cesspot. Homosexuality, lesbianism, everything else, openly practiced, openly accepted. And so he is writing in a way to his Roman audience to where they're going, oh yeah, just like we do today, right? I mean, we look at the whole, what's going on in our culture, what's going on in our world, and a small group of very vocal advocates are driving these degrading passions to where it becomes difficult at times publicly to oppose them. And so he hands them over to degrading passions. And then the last step in verse 28, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased or a depraved mind to do what not ought to do. Now they are filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. And though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but they give approval to those who do practice them. And so now the culture becomes saturated with evil. That's the point here. And he just fires off this list. Now what's funny, not funny, it's interesting, that 2 times in the New Testament, when Paul's writing to a church, he uses a very similar list to say, well, church hadn't fallen very far from this. And he gives this list, you know that in the latter days people will be, and it's a very similar list to this, who deny the power of God. So they're inside the church acting like this. Now in this case, Paul's looking outward to the culture, and he's looking further out, and there's a long history with Babylon and Assyria and Greece and now Rome, of these cultures collapsing. And so they hand over to depraved minds. Now what does that mean? Well, that means people whose thinking is not only primarily sinful, but they are conscious and aware of it. It's intentional. A lot of sinners are sinners, but at some level they're not self-aware of how their mind is working. And yet what happens here is that God hands them over, and now the restraint that was physical through law and culture and so on, and then was internal through conscience and so on, now God just peels all that back and says, you want it, you got it. And the end effect is then utter collapse and destruction. Now what does this do? Well, this yields the fruits and harvest of ever more dominating sins. More and more and more sin dominates. Now, those of us who have been involved in counseling or working with people over the years, maybe you've seen this in your family or with people that you know. You've watched this happen. It just gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. And unless God intervenes, either through saving grace and granting regeneration, or in the Hebrews 6 sense, causes them to be an awakened but not yet converted sinner, so there's moral restraint because they're within the context of some kind of Christian group or gathering, or God grants some kind of renovation of character through morality, then it just goes downhill. It just goes downhill. And so, unless there is a major restraining effect inside a culture, and now the church is largely that, a culture will simply collapse. And so this is what happens. And so this is the big story of heart idolatry. Is that popping out there? Okay. I don't know if it's me or what. Anyway, so this is a big story, but the big story is also people's story. It's the internal story. And so you watch that happen, you counsel against it. It's opportunities for evangelism and so on, to be able to describe and to see And, in what we think of as primitive people, for the most part, you are looking at post-culture, not pre-cultures. Most of the primitive peoples in the world today are the result of a collapse of a civilization. They're not pre-civilization. Now, they may become another pre-civilization. But having grown up in Africa and reading and studying a little bit on African history, most of the major tribes today, at some time in their past, were fairly significant civilizations and cultures. Think of the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans. And there, man, Romans won. I mean, just on sheer full public display in what happened. And if you study the history of the Chinese dynasties, same thing. They start with some sort of high cultural conscience, moral order that wasn't Christian, but nevertheless it held together and allowed a culture to rise, and then it just collapses over time as it spins downward into sin and evil. So what are some examples? Let me just pause. Questions that this might raise in your minds. Questions? Seth.
You just gave kind of one of the larger proof speeches for cultural or political activism.
Of what?
Cultural or political activism.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same concept we hear out there.
Uh-huh.
One of the struggles when I came to this church was trying to reconcile that with the proper focus on the gospel, but even your recognition that the church is a preserving force.
Right. Salt and light in the culture.
Talk a couple minutes about how you reconcile, maybe there's no reconciliation, but how you balance the two between...
Yeah. I think the way we work that out is of course with a both and. But we see that the church's responsibility as a corporate body is to preach, teach, equip, and so forth, which I think we largely do. And then it is individuals engaged in the business place, the workplace, the political sphere, who then their presence, their words, their insistence on, and then in major issues like abortion and so on, there is some level of public advocacy that then fuels private activity. That's the way we think about it. So we want to stay focused on the gospel to the world, and we want to stay focused on making disciples, but we want to make disciples in such a way that as they live in the world, they don't live like the world, and they are informed enough to know how to engage all of this, and it's sometimes to openly oppose it. Certainly all of this should drive how you think about voting and who you put in office and so on, in our culture anyway. So I would encourage any of you who are involved in social action, social justice, political action, to do so with the strength and grace that God gives you, knowing that while we may not wave the banner up here all the time, knowing that we as a church want you to carry that out within your spheres. So publicly taught, publicly instructed, and publicly encouraged, privately practiced. Does that make sense? And that's how the two interface. But just the presence of Christians in the world who are resisting sin has a good effect. But eventually, even in Rome, all through Rome are New Testament churches in most cities. Did that prevent the collapse of Rome? Nope, it didn't. And so, because behind all of this, of course, further is God's plan for history, marching toward a particular eschatological end. So that's another thing going on here. Jess, that's a good question, particularly in the light of this morning. Hopefully you see it. Yes, but go do it yourself. Sign up out here at the table. Commend people like Tiffany. Seth has been a politician, commending his activity in city and in the state level. So, okay? Other questions? I used to teach world history and United States history and government, and going through this with an honest overlay over American history changes your view of American history quite a bit. So, all right, pressing on. So let's think then, if we're going to, what are some examples of idol clusters? And what I want to do here, there's a lot of text here, depending on, in our church, I know you're well taught on this. I'm going to skim across this just a little bit. Sometimes I'm in places where this is not understood, and I'll spend a lot of time here. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to highlight these. You can study them more on your own, and there are a number of good books available in our bookstore, almost by titles in these areas. Well, the first example of an idol cluster, and let me just mention, what do I mean by cluster? Just as the fruit of the Spirit is often is spoken of by Paul in Galatians as being a cluster of virtues compared to grapes, and so sins tend to clump together, and sins tend to hover around, and so it's rare to find one sin in isolation. We just find first in the Scriptures, but certainly in our experience with people, that they tend to cluster. And so where you find one, you're likely to find two others of similar root. Ephesians 5:5, Colossians 3:5. Greed. Greed is idolatry, ruled by wanting what we ought not to have, so that it rules us and masters us into disobedience. This is a primary category for idolatry today. The desire for what is thought of as wealth becomes a ruling desire of greed and coveting. Thinking of it this way allows the category to be transcultural. You do not have to be rich in order to serve the idol of greed and coveting. And that's one, and the Bible clearly says so. Ephesians 5:5, Colossians 3:5 say so, where Paul talks about greed is idolatry. And then the fear of man, acceptance and approval. This is a huge idol, where my idol is other people's approval, other people's acceptance of me, other people's. And you'll notice then in this one that this is a proper desire gone wrong. It is just as wrong not to care at all what people think. I live my own life. I don't care what people think. They can say whatever they want. The Christian is not to function like that. It mattered to New Testament writers how people reacted to them and responded to them, but they weren't controlled by it. You see. And so this is the kind of idol where you can test the question to say, well, do I sin when I don't have other people's approval, or will I sin to get it? That becomes just a shorthand definition of an idol. You can see this in Proverbs 29:25, where the fear of man brings a snare. John 12:42-43, where some leaders who had wanted to join themselves to Christ refused to confess Christ because they knew they were going to get thrown out. And so they wanted the acceptance and the approval of the religious leaders, and they weren't willing to risk it. In Galatians 2:11-13, where fearing the circumcision party resulted in offense to the Gentile believers and a miscommunication of the gospel, and where Peter's desire to not offend but to be accepted by the Judaizers from Jerusalem even caused him to lead Barnabas astray. And it got a public rebuke from Peter. How would you like to have been sitting at that fellowship dinner? You know, these guys come in the door and Peter notices them there and whispers to Barnabas, and they get up and move to the Jewish table. That's what happens. Paul's watching this and stands up and goes, what you just did wrong. What you just did violates the gospel. We are all one. And then there's that speech that we find in Galatians. Boy, fear of man, acceptance and approval is huge. And in a culture where you are defined by who you're associated with and who accepts you, is huge, isn't it? Young people struggle with this. What's the modern word for this? What do we use? Peer pressure. Peer pressure is nothing but the functioning of the fear of man. Another huge idolatry is success, power, control. These cluster together, where our craving for success, our craving for power over others, our craving for control over life and situations and so on. These idolatries cluster together. Again, you can just ask the question, do I sin to gain success, power, or control? Or when I don't have success, power, and control, will I sin to get it? Sin when I don't have it. Number of texts here, 1 Samuel 13. The impatience of Saul usurps the priestly function. He was told to wait. Wait for Samuel to come. You're making a mistake. He made a mistake, and, Samuel comes and tears his garment. When he grabs Samuel and his garment's torn. It's also the kingdom will be torn from you. Luke 22. So here's a discussion among the disciples about who is the greatest. In one recording of that text, it's amazing that Jesus is talking about going to die and the disciples are whispering about who's the greatest. In fact, their mother of three of them, or two of them, comes and advocates for her. I mean, really? 3 John 1, verses 9 and 10. Where loving to be first bears fruit in suppressing opposition in church life. 3 John. Isaiah 30, 1 to 2, where the nation desiring success, desiring power and control, makes alliances with ungodly nations in order to defend themselves against Babylonian takeover. Another idol cluster, a cluster of things that we crave, is comfort, convenience, tranquility, and ease. That didn't afflict anyone in the room, so we'll move on. Luke 9, 23 to 24, and 57 to 62. Where our craving for comfort, convenience, tranquility, and ease, and we will use excuses to keep us from immediate obedience and sacrificial ministry. Our love for comfort, convenience, tranquility, and ease is exposed by a call to discipleship, is challenged by the cross. And I think the more comfort and ease that's available to us in a culture, the more we crave it. It's one of those things that once you have it, you have to have more and more of it to be satisfied with the bit that you got. An obvious one is money and possessions, coveting. Many texts here in your notes, Matthew 6, the heart will tend to follow where the treasure is placed. Luke 12, where you cannot serve God in money. And when you try, what's the consequence? Worry, anxiety, fear about your financial stability. You can't serve two without consequence. 1 Timothy 6, where the desire for riches and the love of money are the roots and source of all kinds of evil, including many pains in not caring for others. In 2 Timothy 3:2, where a craving and idolatry of money and possessions, coveting, becomes characteristic of the Western world. In my notes it says this age, but one of the things as I've thought about this, the way Western culture was built by the Greco-Roman world and then was revived in Europe and imported here to America, that craving for these things is characteristics of a Western world, and therefore when Paul speaks, it's characteristic of his age. Now it's a characteristic of our own. Sensual pleasures as idolatries. And so these cluster of things, and so 2 Samuel 11, patterns of ease and comfort and self-indulgence is part of the heart themes leading to, and idols leading to adultery and incest. I think of David sitting on top of the, and it's interesting that chapter on David's sin with Bathsheba, it begins with a simple sentence that we usually pass over. It was the time of year when kings go forth to war. That's how it starts. And David was at home lounging on his rooftop and saw a woman bathing. Now, why does Samuel, maybe the author there, but more likely not, but why does he record it like that? Well, because David is a man of war who was supposed to be out leading his troops, is lounging at home. And it leads to all the trouble and difficulty that follows. Philippians 3:19, their stomach is their God. 1 Thessalonians 4, knowing God and God's power makes purity possible even in a sensual culture. We want to begin setting up boundaries in the heart to know God and to love brother so as not to defraud one another. And in that 1 Thessalonians 4, what he's referring to is that there was evidently adultery being committed by members of the church and so he talks about the fact that this is not only a sin against God, but it is also you are defrauding a brother or a sister of what is theirs by committing adultery in the body. So these are just some idol clusters that function inside a culture and yet give rise and give character to a culture as a whole. And so just this quick summary. So what does it mean? Rebecca Pippert in Out of the Salt Shaker wrote, what does it mean then to allow Jesus to be Lord of our lives? What does it mean that anything is the Lord of your life? Just this. Whatever controls us is Lord. The person who seeks acceptance is controlled by the people he or she wants to please. We do not control ourselves. We are controlled by whoever is Lord of our life. If Jesus is our Lord, then he is the one controls. He has the ultimate power. And just a quick summary about heart idols. First, heart idols are the false gods that we raise up in our hearts in competition with the true and living God. Even as believers, we have to keep ourselves from idols. So this is an important way of understanding how our heart functions and the trajectory and the poise of our hearts. The tendency to raise up in our own hearts anything that competes with God, his glory, his grace, his word to us, his promises, his precepts. Secondly, we choose to obey our idols and to trust them to bring us the blessings that we want. Always, idols exert command and control with the result that we choose to obey them. We trust them. We believe their promises. And as a result of buying into all of this, then the third thing happens. In turn, those idols rule and drive us. We are both the willful choosers and eventually become the helpless slaves to our idols. Now, if we left off there and stopped there, it would seem hopeless, wouldn't it? And yet, the Scriptures tell us that God's grace through His Spirit helps us to overcome our idols, causes us to renew our minds so that we put off the old and put on the new, so that we do not have to be the helpless slaves to our idols. That Romans 6 tells us that who we present ourselves to will become our master. If we present ourselves to sin, sin will become our master. We will be its slaves. But if we present ourselves to God, and then in a wonderful little switch, He says we will become the slaves of righteousness. And righteousness will master our lives. So the fundamental question for believers are you renewing your mind? And who are you presenting yourself to so that they will master your life? Stephen Charnock. Stephen Charnock was a Puritan. Wrote a 2-volume book on the nature of God. One of my early exposures to Puritan writing. Now you have to listen to this carefully because it's 1600s English. But listen to this. Idolatry. Idolatry is when we act as if something less than God could make us happy without God. Or that God cannot make us happy without the addition of something or someone else. 1600s, Stephen Charnock. Listen to it again. Idolatry is when we act as if something less than God could make us happy without God, or that God cannot make us happy without the addition of something else. Where are you in your own life? Are you seeking, even in your prayers, for God to give you something besides Himself to make you happy? Do your prayers, your petitions, your prayer lists reflect, ultimately, a dissatisfaction with God and possibly heart idols? Don Carson told me one time he was in our home and we gave him time to be on his own, and so he took time to go in my side room. It was kind of functioned as an office, and he took his prayer list with him, and he said as he went in, he said, sometimes my prayer list scares me because it probably tells me more about what I want than anything else. I thought, oh, how true, how true. Let's pray. Father, please grant us, through your Spirit and your Word, insight to know where we would not be happy, joyful, satisfied unless you gave us something besides yourself. Help us to know where we sin to gain what we want, or sin when we don't have what we want. Grant us the grace to acknowledge it, to confess it, and then to forsake it. Give us grace to change our thinking, renew our minds. Give us grace to present ourselves to you so that we become the happy slaves of righteousness. God's people said, Amen. God bless you.